Welcome to Simply by Grace, a podcast of Grace Life Ministries with founder and director Dr. Charlie Bing. This podcast and other helpful resources can be found at our website, gracelife.org. Now, here's Dr. Bing.
Glad you joined us today. We're talking to Dr. Arnold Fructenbaum. If you heard his testimony in our Grace Stories, if you haven't, you need to go back and listen to it. But if you heard that, you've already understood a little bit of the context of where he is coming from as a brought up in strict Hasidic Jewish background, and traveling across the world, landing in the United States, becoming a Christian, getting theological training, Dallas Theological Seminary, New York University, where he wrote his dissertation on Israelology. And so when I think about Arnold Fructenbaum, as many do, we think of just a lot of information and a lot of knowledge and a lot of wisdom crammed into one person. And the outflow of that is a ministry that he started and now directs called Ariel Ministries, which has a lot of messianic Christian emphasis to it. So today we've heard his testimony, we're going to engage a little bit in some discussion of some theological issues about Israelology. What is that? And what's our relationship to the law, maybe, and what's going on in Israel today and the anti-Semitism that we see. So very interesting discussion. So anyway, welcome again, Dr. Fructenbaum.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think people heard a little bit about your background. I'm interested myself in, I haven't read your dissertation, so I'll say that, but this is what you did for New York University, Israelology, the missing link in systematic theology. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And why did you write that, and what are you trying to say in that?
Well, the idea came to me when I was a student at Dallas, and I was taking as many courses with Rari as I could, because I was just then started to get interested in systematic theology and so on. And as we went through it all and things of that nature, a thought came to me that when we got to the section on ecclesiology, if there is an ecclesiology where everything about the church is dealt with, past, present, and future, how come there's no Israelology? And in my first 3 years of covenant theology school, I can understand why they would not develop one, but in a dispensation school, they should develop one. And so after I graduated and other things came up, I wrote a letter and asked them, because they just mentioned they're going to have a section on Chinese studies. I'm not sure how that affected biblically, but it didn't matter. I just what I'm saying. Well, if you can have a department of Chinese studies, you should also have a specific department on systematic theology studies on Israelology.
Are you talking about New York University that you wrote?
This is that Dallas.
You wrote Dallas with this letter.
When I wrote it, I was at New York University.
Mm-hmm.
The thought developed me when I was still at Dallas Seminary.
Okay, got you.
And that's how the thought developed. When I got a letter from one of the professors, Darrell Bach, he says, well, we don't need to develop a Jewish studies department. We have the excellent Old Testament department. That told me to understand the difference between Old Testament studies and Jewish studies, is that they're not co-equal. There's some overlap, but not a lot of overlap. Mm-hmm. So I dropped it for all. Then when I began New York University for my PhD, that's when I came in with the thought of developing and systematized Israelology from a dispensational perspective, because the only perspective that will give you a complete study. So I put together a dissertation, but it turned out to be 2,000 pages long. They wouldn't accept anything that long, so I had to
3,000 or 2,000
pages, but they wouldn't accept it because of its length. Reduced it to about 400 pages, which this is what I turned in. That's not what I want to finish with. Mm-hmm. It's like I got my PhD, but then I took that and went back and took my 2,000 page, able to reduce it to 1,000 pages. And that's the book that is still published today. We have an abridged version of it today, We have Israelology, about 1,000 pages, that covers all the details about Israel past, present, and future, plus other topics that could not be limited to a time zone like past, present, and future. And we still publish that book. We also have a short, abridged version that focuses only on chapter 10 of that longer Israelology, and then some of the appendices and things of that nature. And so that became one of the key courses of our summer school program when we started that 49 years ago. This summer will be our 50th year. And but they give a complete study from the Bible. What does the Bible teach about Israel? One of the two chapters, though it's divided together. One first chapter is just introducing all the terms. Then the two chapters on the post-millennial Israelology, then Arnold Israelology, 2 chapters, then premillennial non-dispensational, and some do better than others, but never have a complete element there. And then finally, I did my own work. So what dispensational has done very well is Israel and Bible prophecy, the future, done very well as far as past, up to the end of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, but they know nothing much about Jewish history since that point of time, which is part of Israel's history and so on. And the weakest area was Israel present. And so Dr. Pentecost says, well, the covenants are now in abeyance, not operative today. So these are not necessarily functional covenants. Well, I couldn't understand that. These were unconditional covenants, and then so on. So I did a whole
He thought that he was teaching that the covenants had been suspended.
So use the word abeyance, whatever that means, but not
I don't know. I need to look that word up. Abeyance, temporary,
not operative today.
Yeah, not operative today, but not canceled either.
Never held a cancellation.
Right.
So on, but was not operative today, and those things of that nature. So, and then another preconceived notion is that God cannot work with Israel and the church at the same time. Well, yes, he can. Israel became a state, then we're still in the church age, and things of that nature. And Israel captured the old city. The church is still not raptured, and so on. So God could work with both peoples at the same time, but he'll remove the church sometime before the tribulation starts. We don't know when, but sometime before the tribulation starts, we'll be gone. Those are the key elements, and we started that school with teaching that on a regular basis. I also put together a Life of Messiah 4-volume set where it deals with all of the rabbinic backgrounds and so on of first century Judaism, which is what's being out in the Gospels and the Book of Acts. And so those all have become now available.
That must have been quite a work. When did that become available?
Well, that's become available. The 4 volumes that became available, I think, at least about 10 years ago now. We put out a 1 volume for people who don't want to read all that material. But the abridged version simply provides all of the same details as the 4 volumes said, but doesn't provide the sources. Whereas in the 4 volumes said, we provide all of the rabbinic sources and things of that nature. So if they're willing to go through them, it's available.
Now, just back up a little bit. Your dispensational Bible training at Cedarville and at Dallas Theological Seminary, it shaped your thinking of Israel, or perhaps you had that thinking already. Can you explain to listeners why dispensational position and interpretation of scriptures, what is it, and why it's important to the study of Israel?
Well, one of the things they say, covenantal premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism has some key differences. In covenantal premill, that this will undergo a national salvation, so most Jews will get saved, but they'll just be inaugurated into the church, and the church will be the main element in the kingdom. But dispensational continues with a consistent distinction between Israel and the church, and God has a special future for Israel. There are covenantal promises and prophetic promises that have not been fulfilled to this day, and actually won't be fulfilled until the Messianic kingdom is established. Even he told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob individually, he'll give them all this land, but the most they own is some wells, and that's it. And so at what point is he going to fulfill those promises? So that requires a resurrection of the patriarchs, requires there's establishment in the land and things of that nature. So we need to take what God says about Israel seriously, and that there'll be a consistent distinction between the church and Israel. So the apostles, for example, laid the foundation of the church. So they're part of the church, and when the rapture comes, they also go. But when the kingdom is established, what is the role of the apostles? Twice the Messiah said they'll sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. They'll be part of the Jewish government of the Messianic kingdom, and so on. So Jewish believers will have another separate role for the kingdom because they're part of the outworking of the Abrahamic covenantal promises.
So one of the distinctions of dispensationalism is that they keep that clear distinction between the church and Israel, whereas other systems will teach that Israel replaced, or the church replaced it, or Israel replaced the church, or the church was the Old Testament Israel, um, however we say it correctly, but they saw no distinct future for the nation of Israel.
Right. Yeah, there's so many prophecies about the kingdom that it clearly shows a distinct future for Israel. There's also some of it in the New Testament, not as much as in the Old. Still, there's even New Testament is there, like the role of the apostles in the kingdom. They're not functioning in the church. They're functioning as judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
In 1948, when Israel was given land in Palestine, what we'd call Palestine area, Canaan area, whatever it was called back in those days. Did not that turn a lot of theologians' heads and change their theology? Or did it?
I think that's when dispensationalism began to be so very popular. The establishment of Israel in 48, the capturing of the old city and the temple compound in 67, that really made dispensation a breath of fresh air and so on. So a lot of people were moving into a dispensational group. Now, in the 4 years I was in Dallas, what surprised me is how little we had as far as being taught this a systematic dispensational theology. There were things taught here and there, but there was never given to us a class that focused on dispensational Israelology and so on. So when dispensation was beginning to be attacked, how many churches that used to be dispensational have transferred to one of the three covenant schools. And I noticed also a lot of the churches, they just support us when the pastorate changes and they move from a dispensational to a covenantal position, they would drop supporting us in other dispensational programs and so on. So we need to make sure people preach what dispensation does teach over against what it does not teach, because all too often they're being mistaught about what dispensationalism is, and things of that nature, and that they need to know what we do believe, what we do teach, over against what we do not teach, what we do not believe. And it's not always clear to a lot of people that go to different schools nowadays.
Yeah. What are some examples of those differences that you're talking about that we fail to teach?
But it's in the seminary. At least I went to the king of dispensational schools at Dallas Seminary, but never get a course of dispensational theology as a whole. I learned that on my own.
That's true. We never did have a course on that. I never had a course on that.
I never had to. They just simply assumed by going to that seminary, that's what we'll learn. Well, unfortunately, that's not always true. And a lot of these students didn't come from dispensational backgrounds, and they really need to learn specifically what dispensationalism is as over against what it is not. So we're not being told 7 different ways of getting saved, for example, and statements like that nonsense. That's not something dispensationalism has ever been teaching.
So the dispensational understanding of scripture is taking the scriptures literally, grammatically, in its clear sense of the language, yields us dispensationalism. And that's kind of the baseline for Israelology, because without that, we have promises about Israel that are either applied to the church or misinterpreted or allegorized spiritually. And so they really become meaningless. But let me ask you this. When Israel went back to the land in 1948, were given the land in 1952, I guess, recognized by the UN, how would you see that as fitting into the scriptures? Because the scriptures tell us that Israel is judicially blinded by God. So, do you see this as God's working regardless, in spite of, or despite their blindness or spiritual blindness?
Well, the sausage already goes back into Hebrew Bible, like especially in Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 13, where it pictures the Messiah as being discouraged because of Israel's rejection. And the message comes to him that the Israel's rejection did not catch the Father by surprise. It was very much part of God's plan. And for a period of time, he will be the light to the Gentiles. And there'll be a period of Gentile salvation, but eventually Israel will come back and believe on him. And that's when the Messianic kingdom will finally be established. But these are all Old Testament basics. Even the outline of Romans in Paul follows chapter 49 outline and so on. So what was already happening by New Testament times was already prearranged by Old Testament times, that this is what God said would happen. There would be a long period of time of Gentile salvation, but that will never lead to the exclusion of all Jews. There'll always be Jews coming to faith. There'll always be a remnant. Sometimes the remnant was small. Elijah's day, 7,000 out of how many Jews were there. Counting Elijah, make that 7,001, very small compared to the larger nation. The southern kingdom probably had more than 7,000, but in the modern kingdom, that was the maximum right there, at least as at a point in Elijah's lifetime.
And at the end of Romans 11, Paul explains this, I think, and mentions that the God turning away from the Jews provokes the Gentiles to jealousy. Can you explain what that phrase means? How does provoke the Jews to jealousy? The Gentile salvation provokes the Jews to jealousy. How does that work, or how do you understand that?
I put together in this theology, there's a special section in Romans 9 through 11, and the key word was parazelao, para meaning come alongside of, and then the Greek word zelos, which could mean either to be jealous or to be zealous or to be envious. And this that putting the one word together, Paul was saying he's quite delighted that God called him to do Gentile evangelism, not because it's easier, but because what he saw was that a Gentile becomes a believer in the Jewish Messiah, and he should being side by side by a Gentile or by a Jew, he should live the kind of life that the New Testament says we should live, but that alone doesn't save anybody. Secondly, there must be a clear presentation of the gospel message itself, and that should provoke the Jews to jealousy. Sadly, much of in church history, the church has provoked the Jews to anger, not to jealousy. Because the Jews for Jesus did a survey a couple of decades ago among North American Messianics, when the question was, did you come to faith through a Jewish believer, Gentile believer? Not just a small portion, but a majority came to faith through Gentile believers that provoked them to jealousy. That's true in my own case.
Wow. So, yeah, I when I think about that verse, I think, well, most Gentiles in churches make Jewish people angry in their presentation in the world in general, which is nominally Christian, like the things that we see going on today provokes the Jews to anger or fear even. But the jealousy you're talking about when the Jews see the zeal that Gentiles have for their Messiah, for their Jewish Messiah. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's the way it should have worked, but unfortunately, among even just some evangelical people, Martin Luther, his last few years was very anti-Semitic.
Right.
He understood grace, the salvation by grace. I'm sure he was saved, but the way he turned against the Jews was not going to provoke any Jews to jealousy.
Exactly. Yeah. And that spirit of anti-Semitism. So I want to talk about that because, we're all surprised to see that in Martin Luther, who we usually, lionize as the hero of the faith who changed history and the church and theology. And yet he hated the Jews. Was it because they rejected the gospel?
Well, for all the reasons we don't know, but because he fell with this the new emphasis on what is a Christian, that they'll see we're not the same as the Catholic Church, and therefore they should see that they need to come to our faith. But I don't think he realized by then there were centuries of persecution by the three C's, and so Jews were always suspicious
Crusades.
of crusades and so on, and that kind of thing. So that became more of a problem, and so on. So you have to really be very careful how you get the message. If you just say church, Christian, cross, better to just say assembly, better to say believer, better to say assembly and things of that nature. While you use certain words that automatically raise up the wall in light of church and Jewish history.
That's a good point. And don't call your ministry Campus Crusade. Change the name as quickly as you can if you want to reach the world. But can we talk about anti-Semitism today now? Because it's something that has persisted throughout history, but also throughout the Bible. And frankly, you and I know the Bible, and many others know the Bible. We know anti-Semitism. We know what's behind it. But frankly, I'm like many people in that I'm watching in the news and listening to, they're surprised by the degree of it. They're surprised by the intensity of it today. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think the Holocaust gave anti-Semitism a bad name, so it became kind of downward. I think it was always present to some degree, and exposed itself in various ways, but they always had to keep it kind of under the carpet or under the towel or whatever. But what happened with the situation October 7, where in one day 1,400 Jews got killed for no reason than other reason than being Jewish. And when Israel retaliated the way the Bible said they would retaliate much more severely, and so on in the Genesis passage, all of a sudden you had in all the cities in the USA, different parts around the world, they also pro-Palestinian. Well, that had to be something underground for a long time, now becoming super popular and so on. Why didn't they raise up objections to for the mass murder of Jews on one day? They didn't. And Israel has the right to defend itself and things of that nature. So taken to the principle of Hagar that the angel of Jehovah mentioned to her, this would have been in chapter 16, where Hagar gets pregnant. She runs away. Angel tells her to go back, and then says four things. Number one, you shall bear a son and call his name Ishmael. Number two, he and his descendants will be wanderers in the desert. Point three, he will attack those other cultures. Number four, they will counteract and attach him. And so the two closest brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, not Isaac, Israel and Jacob, who were the twin brothers. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That God sustained the covenant through Jacob and not through Esau. And so Esau had to leave the land and settled in what later became Edom after him. But that animosity has continued and continuous to this day.
And there's a spiritual element too, right? I mean, from the very beginning, Genesis 3:15, we see Satan is going to be persecuting, trying to destroy the woman's seed, which Paul tells us is Christ.
It's primarily spiritual, but works its way out in the physical as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a spiritual conflict. This isn't just like the church I'm attending at the moment, the pastor didn't want to say anything because he didn't want to get involved in politics. Well, the issue here is not politics. They need to read chapters like Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy chapters 28, 29, and 30. It goes beyond merely a political or racial issue. That's
Yes,
something well, Jews are hated in countries where the Jews don't even live anymore, never lived there. Like Japan, Japan never had any great number of Jews, yet you find anti-Semitism even in Japan.
that's amazing. So the spiritual influences around the world. It always gets me to watch these pundits on TV or listening to them on the internet or radio, and they're scratching their heads. Where is this hatred coming from? And they're talking about context. But if they only understood the Bible, they would have their questions answered. Anybody that understands the Bible knows exactly where this anti-Semitism comes from, and it's not reasonable. It's spiritual.
Right, exactly. The primary problem is spiritual, and it moves out into the physical.
But let's talk about the politics of it a little bit, because the argument that is used is that the Jews want to exterminate or commit genocide on the Palestinians, and that the Palestinians are rightful owners of the land. So does Israel have a right to the land? How do you argue that?
Really argued biblically, it's Israel's land because God says so in the Bible. You protect the Bible as being holy scripture, and therefore, and don't try to reinterpret certain passages that you may not like, that it is a biblical issue. And so Satan's war against that begins in Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed.
And the Palestinians never had a nation,
No,
did they?
Palestine was named after the Philistines by Hadrian at the end of the Second Jewish Revolt in 135 AD. It became known as that. But interestingly, the term Palestinian for long now, was applied to the Jewish population, not the Arab population.
Mm-hmm. Well,
The 6-Day War, this was true. My major at Hebrew University was called Palestinology, but that was applied to Jews back then. After the 6-Day War in 1967, slowly things began to change. The word Palestinian was applied to the Arab population and not the Jewish population. But the early Israelis called themselves Palestinians. And there was no Israeli underground because out of Poland was the Palestinian underground. But at that point, that term was meant for Jews at that time.
and it just referred to the region, people from the region.
From the region, and this was and dealt with the focus on the Jewish population in the region. It became transferred to the Arab population only after the 6-Day War.
So you mentioned the tie of the Palestinians to their Arab roots, and it goes all the way back to Ishmael, of course. But why then are the Palestinians not taken care of? Why are we, the United States, supplying humanitarian aid? Why isn't Egypt, why isn't Saudi Arabia helping their Arab cousins?
Well, for some reason, they thought then that they would win their war in independence very quickly, and that they would win and they would run. And when that failed, Gaza Strip was won by the Egyptians until 1967. So for 19 years, the Arab population of the Gaza Strip were under Arab authority, but the Egyptian Arab authority. But then Israel took over and did their work until they pulled out, but God promised or said would happen in Genesis 15 and so on. There'll be a continuous, and 16, I should say, continuous animosity of the Arabs towards the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And the other 6 sons that Abraham had largely became the population of different Arab tribes in what is now Yemen and Saudi Arabia. But even they developed this animosity against the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Islam became the main religion of the Arab population. They targeted the Jews for not converting, in the same way that Martin Luther, in a different way, failed to get the Jews all converted, and he became already was very anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Well, it's a tragedy that there's been so much violence in that area, but that's history and that's predicted and that's prophecy. How do you see this recent war? I guess it's yet to have a name, the war against Hamas. How do you see that fitting into Scripture? I maybe it's a question you can't answer specifically, but maybe in general, or can you answer it more specifically?
Specifically, we cannot because there's no specific prophecy about this present-day conflict. But if you go to those 4 chapters, like I said, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, 29, 30, it points out that both the Jewish failure and so on, and that if they're obedient, they'll be safe, they'll be kept successful, and things of that nature. But if they disobey, they'll fall into different periods of disobedience. First will come subjugation, fulfilled by the days of the judges. Secondly, captivity, fulfilled by the Assyrian and the Babylonian captivities. And thirdly, worldwide dispersion, which resulted for their rejection of the prophet like unto Moses. This is the background.
Mm-hmm. That's how you got to Poland.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so the conflict will always be there. But theologically, it should be remembered that they're still the chosen people. And the Abrahamic covenant guarantees the land belongs to Jewish people, but the land covenant says the enjoyment of the land will be conditioned on obedience.
Right. I just want to repeat those chapters that you mentioned: Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30. It's just for our listeners' sake. I wanted to repeat that.
And so for what they would realize is that in disobedience, as long as they're failing to believe in their Messiah, they will have the attacks outside the land uncommon, but also they'll have attacks inside the land. There was never a time that there were no Jews in the land, but for many years they were a small minority, and the smallest they were, they're being attacked and attacked. So October 7th shows another example of what the prophet said would happen, that this would be a continuous, ongoing conflict. But so in the realm of that larger picture, so yes, October 7th fits a role, and but also that Israel had the right to counterattack, which is what's happening. But as far as having peace with, they can call for a two-state solution and so on. But ultimately, peace will come when Israel becomes a believing people, and there'll be, well, some Arab nations are going to be totally destroyed, like southern Jordan, represented by Edom. But then the Ammonites and Moabites, which are also primarily Arab today, undergo a national conversion. So there'll be some good news. Egypt also undergo a national salvation. There are the old native Egyptians, the Coptics. Most Egyptians today are part of the Arab invasion.
Mm.
But Egypt has a positive future. They'll come to faith, and Egypt will have a national salvation. They'll suffer 40 years of dispersion because of the long history of anti-Semitism, but then gathered, according to Ezekiel, and for the remaining 960 years of the kingdom, there'll be a saved nation called Egypt.
That's great. That's great to know. Now, in the present, Israel is, as you say, experiencing the consequences of their disobedience. They're living in unbelief. I love the country of Israel. I support what they're doing. But how do we mitigate our support for a country that kicks out Christian missionaries and we know is rejecting their Messiah, our Christ, our Messiah, our Savior? So is that a little bit of a tricky tightrope to walk between supporting what Israel does and loving them, and yet condemning what they do in unbelief?
Well, the example I use, I'm an immigrant to America. I'm very pro-American and so on. I don't necessarily support a lot of the governmental decisions the American government may make. Solely, I don't support abortion, legalizing it, and so on. But as a country and the right to defend itself, I support the USA in these areas. Same thing with Israel. We support Israel. Biblically, we are obligated to support Israel, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and things of that nature. but we cannot support every decision the Israeli government might make, such as abortion and things of that nature. So
Okay.
we take those two things distinct.
Yeah.
And if we talk about Psalm 122, verse 6, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, we know prophetically the peace of Jerusalem won't really come until they become a saved nation. So the practical way of praying for the peace of Jerusalem is to pray for the salvation of Jewish people today. So in Paul's Israelology in Romans 11, there are Jews getting saved today that he prays for, and but he realizes the national salvation won't happen until the end of the tribulation. But Jews can be saved throughout this period, and he prays for both salvations. This was national salvation, this was individual salvation, things of that nature. So we should remember we can support a nation without necessarily supporting every policy that nation follows.
That makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that answer. And actually, that was going to be my last question, which I think you answered well. What does it mean to pray for the peace of Jerusalem? And the way I understood your answer was that we pray for the Jewish people to be converted right now as individuals to Christ.
Right, because peace in Jerusalem won't be happening until you have a national salvation.
Yeah.
So there'll be periods of peace, but there'll be periods of conflict.
Yeah, it's always puzzled me a little bit because we know that Israel's going to find peace in the end days when they are restored as a nation. So why do we need to pray for that? But you're saying to pray right now for the people of Israel to come to Christ.
So we can pray for Israel's future national salvation, recognizing that prayer won't be answered till just before the second coming. At the same time, he was also praying for individual Jewish salvation in chapter 10, chapter 11, and he was happy that individual, he's called to Gentile evangelism, but he always went to the Jew first, every time, always to synagogue first, and then he went to the Gentiles. That was his policy. We also recognize that the more Gentiles he lead to the Lord, the more Gentiles will be available to provoke individual Jews to jealousy. Faith.
Another way of looking at it, yeah.
Most Jews today who are believers came to faith through Gentiles who provoked them to jealousy. The church as a whole has failed on this, but individual believers have not failed. They've been
Well,
quite successful.
that I appreciate that perspective. That actually opens up a little new vista for me to think about praying for the peace of Jerusalem, because I've always wondered a little bit about exactly what does that mean for today. But and that's exactly what Ariel Ministries is doing, and so we appreciate your work in doing that. You've had quite an effective ministry, I'm sure, in converting Jewish people.
That's been good.
God has been good. He's always good. So we want to get again a thank you for this discussion. I think it's been very fruitful, especially some of the hints about how the Gentile church can talk about the Jews without using maybe the word church, crusade, other things that you mentioned. So we appreciate that. Well, we're gonna say thank you and goodbye to Dr. Arnold Fructenbaum, but it was a fruitful discussion. A lot of insight there from someone who's lived through a lot of history himself and experienced what it is like to be a Jew in this world. And we do need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Pray for Jewish people to be saved. And if you know those around you, direct them to Jewish people around you, direct them to Ariel Ministries, perhaps online, or get the magazine or some of the other literature, and perhaps let it find its way into their hands, because it's very well done, well written. So we appreciate that discussion, and we look forward to you joining us again for another. Until all here.
And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. For more resources, or to help spread the message of God's life-changing grace, visit our website at gracelife.org. We'd love to hear from you. Send us a message at simplybygrace@gracelife.org. See you next time.